following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back, in case you're wondering, with George Case. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and we've got a full panel of folks to talk to George Case. Why don't you introduce everybody, and let's have a great show. George.
Well, thank you very much, Ralph. What we're going to discuss today, at least initially, and I thought our panel, which I'd like to introduce, David Hubler, author of The Nats and the Grays in D.C., Alan Blumkin, who's in New York and is a Pittsburgh Pirates devotee, but Alan is very much knowledgeable of baseball in general, baseball history. And Ronnie Rabinovitz out in snow country of Minneapolis, where, Hot Stove League, I guess Ronnie is still going to be fired up out there because spring training is in Florida, but I'm sure there's nobody outside throwing anything but snowballs up your way.
That's right. You're right. We've had a lot of snow.
Well, I thought what we could do this morning, and I'll start off with David, and Ralph, if you want to jump in, Ronnie, Alan, any of you folks want to talk about baseball periodicals. We're into spring training, and it's the beginning of the baseball season, and, of course, we have that little episode last couple of days, Bryce Harper signing a $330 million 13-year contract with the Phillies, which just absolutely blows me away. But we can talk about that in a while. But I thought I'd open it up with David. You might want to talk about your younger days when maybe baseball periodicals and magazines was something that you look forward to seeing every spring.
Yeah, well, not only every spring. My favorite was Sport magazine, just one Sport, S-P-O-R-T, and it was devoted to all the sports. It had wonderful color photography in it, and the articles were very good. They were, in terms of intellectual quality, they were a step below Sports Illustrated, but they were very good articles to read and to enjoy. So, I mean, I had a subscription to that for a long time, and I don't recall when they actually went out of business, but I was in one of their articles later on, which sort of pleased me very much when we had, and I've talked about it, when we had that almost postponed basketball game up in Utica, New York because of a snowstorm, which is a sort of an appropriate topic. The other thing I enjoyed every day was my father bringing home the World Telegram and Sun and those wonderful Willard Mullen sports cartoons. I never did get to go down to spring training until much, much later. But the World Telegram and Sun had some great sports writers, and the whole season, in fact, even now, with the Washington Post, I mean, so many of the articles are just really trivial stuff, but I still read them anyway, because starting in February, you begin to get some articles that comes out of the miscellaneous column, and into the mainstream. There was, speaking of articles about writing about sports, the Nats closer had a very good article in today's Washington Post in the op-ed page, calling for a Major League Baseball to look at the reason that there's one company up in the Buffalo area that makes all the Major League hats, and they are shutting down the office there and moving the hats manufacturing to some small non-union place in Florida. And as a player rep, I assume, he feels it was very well written. I think he went to Stanford, as a matter of fact. So I try to read everything, and of course, in the winter, you don't get much baseball. So that Sport magazine was my favorite, and if anybody knows when it folded, I'd be interested to know.
I don't think it's folded. I think it's still
no, it's
around. I think it's still there.
No, it's not there anymore.
Still there.
No, it I've tried, because when I was researching the book,
it's been gone for a number of years.
Huh. I thought it was still available.
The editor for a long time was a fellow by the name of Dick Schaap. I don't know if you guys remember him at all.
Sure.
But
he was a sports writer, I believe, wasn't he?
Yes.
Right.
He was. And
Dick Schaap.
He also had a panel show on television, much like this, where he'd have 4 or 5 experts and mavens on, and he'd keep going back and forth. That was a terrific show, and I'm trying to think of the name of it, but I can't.
Sports Reporters?
Pardon me?
Sports Reporters?
Could have been.
Yeah, because I think his son, Jeremy, who's all over ESPN, succeeded him.
Yeah, he was terrific, and like I totally agree with you, David. That was a pleasant magazine to read.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The color photography was absolutely terrific, and we cut out pictures as kids and bring them down for autographs. One of the and I still have some of them already signed and autographed from when I was a kid, and that's special to me. Ronnie, Spring Training magazine.
I used to love the Street and Smith baseball magazine, and I always waited for it to come out. I couldn't wait for it to come out, and when it came out, I would just thoroughly go through it. It was terrific. And then also I used to have a subscription to Baseball Digest, and I look forward to that when that would come out. It was great.
Well, Baseball Digest had 2 great editions per year. One of them was Rookie Edition, and they would go team by team and talk about all the prospects coming up. Still have some of those in my files from when I was a kid, and it's interesting to see how they rated players, and
it was a good magazine.
It was good, and the March, that was in February, and in March they had the preseason with all the rosters and all the numbers and breakdowns. We were very lucky to have periodicals like that when we would get.
It was great.
Yeah. Alan, what was your favorite?
I had several. And the annuals, like Ronnie, I enjoyed Street and Smith's. Dell, after they stopped the little books that they had through 1953, I still have all of those. They started putting out magazines. One was Dell Baseball Annuals, gave you previews of everything, and then they would come out with about a month later called Who's Who in the Big Leagues, and they give you details on every all 400 players. Another one was Who's Who in the Major Leagues by a man named John Carmichael. That stopped after 1952. And then, of course, the Who's Who in Baseball, which was the Little Red Book that was stopped 2 years ago. And there's a much cheaper version of the Sporting News Register. And the Sporting News Baseball Guide, and when I was 14 years old, I discovered the Sporting News. I was a latecomer to that, and I said, "This is old baseball. It's got to be crazy." And I would renew every year when they offered the Baseball Guide as a gift, which was $1 separate cover at that point, and I renewed Sporting News for a year, and you'd get the Baseball Guide for free. And the other ones were I used to read sport. I was early on Sports Illustrated. My parents got me a subscription for my birthday when I was 12, and I missed basically the first half a year. And there were Baseball Digest, of course, and there were 1 or 2 others that didn't last very long. I think the big problem that they ran into, besides the decline of print media, is that basically you can't come out with preview issues anymore because half the free agents are still out there.
Right.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a major problem. I'm sure a number of the magazines that are out already didn't have Harper or maybe even Machado going where they're winding up, but that has caused to me it's a big problem. And I think it's like most of us here, I find that what they call progress is not always what they call new is not always progress. And I miss the decline of the Baseball Almanac that Baseball America puts out. I subscribed to that for a long time, but I dropped it because all it is articles. There's no numbers there anymore. I puts out the Baseball Almanac every year, which is essentially a substitute for the guide. And they also put out a prospect book every year, which goes team by team, and they charge $35 for it. It's not like a one issue, one monthly issue like Baseball Digest used to put out. But I miss all that a lot.
Okay. Just want to ask you guys, when you got the sporting news in the mail, did you read it back to front?
Oh, yeah, even the minor league stuff.
Yeah, I did too.
They used to carry a AAA box scores, which I used to read passionately with the three leagues, the International League, American Association, the Pacific Coast League, because you'd see things that you never saw before, 7-inning games, and you could figure out from there who might be worthy of a promotion. It really, the decline of, I get USA Weekly now, but the decline of print media is really, really something that I feel very bad about.
George Case, what did your dad read before going to spring training?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, Ralph, because and what I just heard Alan talk about. When I was a kid growing up, my dad was always anxious to get going for spring training, but the sporting news was what ball players read. And back when my dad was playing, believe it or not, I have copies of it. The sporting news was called a broadsheet. It was the same size as the New York Times, Washington Post. It was that format. And then later on, they changed it to a tabloid, a smaller version, and started to bring in other sports. But for many, many years, the sporting news was known as the Bible of baseball. That's what it was. It was all baseball stories.
Right. And all baseball.
And the fellows, there were ball players, they would always be looking every week, for their batting averages or what they're doing. Articles, and my dad had a couple front page articles and drawings on front cover of sporting news. So that's what he always read. And as a youngster, I did the same thing. And a lot of his magazines and periodicals were either sent to him or somehow they wound up in his memorabilia because I have them. And I've got covers of Baseball Magazine, which was very popular back then. And also, as Alan mentioned, the Who's Who. I've got a couple of those. They would do previews of ball clubs, and it was a lot different than what Alan was mentioning now because you did not have free agency, so you knew what those teams were. I've got pictures from the Spalding Guide, Reach Guide of the 38, 39, 40 Washington Senators, and that was the team. You didn't, unless somebody was traded after the publication deadline, you knew what the team was. Now, today, with free agency, it's certainly different because you've got guys like Harper and Machado. They've just signed within the last week or so. So you really, if you have a preview, you don't have those two guys in the teams that they wound up with. So it's a little bit different. But for me growing up, I can just recall, my dad looking forward to getting the sporting news every week. And it was all the news of whatever was happening with the ball clubs. But back then, it was all baseball. And as I said, it was the broadsheet, it was the large format, and then the sporting news, went to the tabloid, smaller deal. And I believe the Spinks were involved, and it really changed the format because what happened initially from all baseball, and then it became all sports, and then I think it's even out of business today. I don't even think sporting news is produced.
No. You mentioned the Spinks. They, especially Charles, the senior, very conservative guy, and maybe they were out of St. Louis, which back then was the most far west location in baseball, and they were kind of Missouri is kind of a border city, to be a border state to begin with, and maybe Ronnie can back me up on this. I don't think the Spinks played a positive role in Jackie's coming into baseball.
You're right. That's right.
Would you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, they were never really into Jackie, and they were not. I think they were opposed to bringing him in.
Yeah, not just Jackie, any black.
Any black, right, exactly, right. Yeah, they were not. What could you say? Well, St. Louis was a different.
They were not progressive.
They were not progressive. That's right. They were not progressive. Okay. Exactly. Yeah, that's true.
Baseball is a very, very conservative, organization. Baseball with a capital B always has been. Okay. Yeah. George, off the subject a little bit. I know Mickey Vernon was like an uncle to you, and took you under his wing. Of course, your dad, the influence he had. What other, who other of your dad's teammates influenced you? Who liked kids?
Well, I think, the ones that I recall the most, obviously, was, my father, because I was under his wing, every day. But, Mickey Vernon, but Cecil Travis was a wonderful guy, Buddy Lewis, Dutch Leonard. These guys were very close personal friends of my dad, and many times would come to visit us in the off season. Stan Spence, and when my dad opened up a sporting goods store, he had Stan come up for an appearance. He had Lefty Gomez come for an appearance. He had Dutch Leonard come for an appearance. Mickey. So these were all personal friends of my dad, and I always consider him as family. And it wasn't until later when I realized they were ball players. To me, they were Uncle Mickey was Mickey Vernon, and Uncle Sid was Sid Hudson, and Dutch Leonard. They were all family to me as a youngster growing up, and I was very fortunate because I didn't have to go to a ballpark to see them. They came right to my living room. So it was a wonderful time growing up for me in baseball, and the fact is that baseball had been such a wonderful part of my life from my earliest memory.
Okay, just a little short synopsis. You mentioned Dutch Leonard, Sid Hudson, I think you mentioned Cecil Travis. What about these people do you remember as people? I know about their prowess on the ball field, but when they came to visit, what were they like?
Well, they were great. I mean, they would talk. I mean, my dad and Mickey and Sid and Dutch and Stan, they would talk about baseball, but they would talk about life. I mean, that's what it was. And where a good restaurant was, or, good food, or, food was hugely important to ball players. And they would talk about, where they could get a really good meal on the road. They would also remember some funny things that happened to them during the year. But basically, they were just like you and I and all of us today. I mean, they're talking some of it baseball and some of it life in general. So for me, I wasn't there with them and saying, geez, Dutch, how do you throw your knuckleball? Or geez, Sid, what do you do on a 3-2 count to a hitter who's a slugger? Where do you pitch? I didn't talk to him about that. I talked to him about growing up, and the fact is that my dad and these players were very, very close friends. So they were family friends to me, and I can only tell you from personal experience. I grew up in an area where kids would be enamored with a ball player. Obviously, most kids are. But, I was fortunate because they were family friends. And I recalled one time, I think I've mentioned this before, when I was in junior high school, Mickey Vernon had just won the American League batting title. I think it was 1953. And I happened to mention to a couple of friends of mine in school that Mickey was coming over for dinner. Well, Mickey and his wife Lib came for dinner. We were having a nice visit. All of a sudden, the doorbell rings, and there's a whole bunch of kids outside. And Mickey and my dad started laughing, and my dad said to me, he said, okay, well, you did it. Now you be the gatekeeper. You got to let them in one at a time, and they would get Mickey's autograph, talk to him for a couple minutes, and be on their way. So that's the kind of life experiences that I had as a youngster.
And it certainly didn't help hurt your reputation with your friends. I mean,
well, they thought I was a bigger deal than I was, I guess, because I knew them all. But that was fun for me. I mean, I learned later on that I shouldn't talk that way because they, a ball player, they deserve privacy and that kind of thing. But back then it was a big thing in school. You say, "Oh my God, Case knows so and so, and he's coming over for dinner, so we got to go over and get their autograph." So.
What position? You were a first baseman, George. Am I correct?
Yeah, I played first and I pitched. So, I played first, obviously Mickey Vernon being a first baseman, but Mickey was left-handed, but I tried to, model myself after Mickey because I was big, he was big. I was a little probably stronger, but, I learned how to dig balls out. Mickey was outstanding fielder. And then when Sid Hudson, Sid was a terrific pitcher, and I was a pitcher, so I learned a little bit about pitching from my dad as well as Sid. And, a lot of times with pitching, I'll never forget one of the first things I ever learned as a pitcher, and my dad told me, he said, now, if you're starting to make a mistake, you're going outside or whatever, he says, step into your mistake. I'll never forget what that advice to you, and that's what they're telling pitchers now. What they tell them today on spin velocities and all that stuff, I can't tell you. But back then, if you were having a certain amount of trouble, you'd look at your mechanics or where you were on the rubber, and if you needed to make an adjustment, you would make it, and a pitching coach would be able to tell you that. So I was fortunate because, as far as pitching coaches, Dutch Leonard, Sid Hudson, they were at the top of the game when I was a kid, and Mickey Vernon as far as fielding and being a tremendous first baseman, and I happened to play first base. And I also played the outfield. So, I learned outfield play from my father. I learned first base play from Mickey and pitching from Sid and Dutch.
That's great. That's great, George.
I was just thinking that you went to Rutgers, and get off the subject for a second. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I saw a blurb. Longtime Rutgers coach passed away the other day.
I missed that, Ralph. I didn't know. I mean, I know some of the Rutgers coaches have passed away from when I was there.
Fred Hill was
Pardon me?
Fred Hill. It was all in the papers here.
Freddie Hill. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Then if it was Fred Hill, then I missed that, and I'm sorry to hear that because I knew Fred really well. Freddie took the Rutgers baseball job after Matt Bolger, and Matt had taken the job from after my dad because my dad had left and went back into baseball. Matt had been a football coach, and he asked me, he said, George, you got to sit with me on the bench, help me, because I have no idea what I'm doing. And he said, I know with your father, he knew what he was doing, obviously, but I don't. So I did. I helped Matt the first year or two, and then Matt wound up in the College Baseball Coaches Hall of Fame. But Freddie Hill was the longtime baseball coach at Rutgers. Great guy. Last saw him probably 2 years ago, and he had a stroke, and he was struggling. He had resigned as the baseball coach for health reasons. But I'm really sorry to hear that. I missed that about Freddie. He was a really good guy.
The article said he was 84, and he had I think the most wins at Rutgers as a baseball coach, said something like 940, and he had I think was one of two coaches that overall had over 1,000.
Well, you know what, Alan, I think you're absolutely right with those numbers. Freddie was at Rutgers for a long, long time, and before that he had been at Montclair State, I believe. And Freddie was really a very accomplished baseball coach. He had a son, Fred Hill Jr., who was the Rutgers basketball coach for a couple of years. And Freddie had some outstanding talent that played for him at Rutgers. And the most recent one who's still playing, and I know that, Alan, you've questioned his hitting, but he had a terrific college career, and that was Todd Frazier.
Right.
Yeah, I know that. When I saw that article, I thought of you right away because of Rutgers, and baseball.
Right.
Yeah.
And Jeff Torborg.
Well, I'm really sorry to hear that. For some reason, I just missed it. But Fred was a terrific guy, and he and I had many conversations, and he came to a couple events when I was involved in speaking, and we always had a chance to visit, and I really liked Freddie very much, and I'm sorry to hear that he passed.
Yeah, you can probably find the articles if you Google his name.
Yeah, I will. I will definitely, after our podcast, I'm going to look it up. Absolutely.
Okay. Glad I could help.
Yeah,
I have a question for you, George. You played 3 positions as an amateur.
Yep.
Had you stuck to any of those? Had you pitched full-time? Had you played first full-time? Outfielder first? Do you think you would have been better off for it?
Yeah, I think so. Looking back, it's just that for me, the game came so natural. I could play just about any position, and I know that my dad and I used to talk later. He said, you probably would have been better off if you concentrate on one, because I loved playing first base. I started playing first base when I was 11 years old in Little League, and then I pitched because I was big. And then when I got into high school, I could run, so they put me in the outfield. But I could play any position, but you become, jack of all trades, master of none. And if I had probably concentrated on one, it would have been much better for me as a ball player. But again, for me, the game came very easily, and I can remember going to ball games. I'd have to take 2 gloves. I'd take my pitcher's and outfielder's glove, and I'd take my first baseman's mitt because I wasn't sure which position I was going to play.
On the other hand, being skilled in all 3 positions transcends a little bit. There are skills in the outfield that you come to realize when you're playing first base, and pitching as well. Am I correct about that?
Well, no, it's true, Ralph. But what all those 3 positions give you, and I don't want to dominate this discussion, but what they give you is a sense of baseball, what to do. If you're in the outfield, you're saying to yourself, okay, ball's hit to me, whatever the situation, where do I throw the ball? If you're in the infield, I love playing first base because you're in the action all the time. And as far as pitching, pitching you learn. You learn how to throw a certain pitch, or you learn, where the weakness of the hitter is. My biggest problem in pitching was that I could throw hard. I had a good fastball, but I had no control whatsoever. And I think probably if I had concentrated on pitching and the mechanics of it, it would have been a lot better for me to be as a pitcher because, I was big. And the fact is that pitchers, if you're a big guy, you look at guys like Drysdale or Gibson, those guys, they intimidated hitters. Now, the other guys that are, more average in size, a guy like a Whitey Ford or Bobby Shantz, small, that kind of stuff, you get by on your guile. And you don't necessarily try to overpower anybody, but you learn how to pitch. If you're a big guy, and another guy I'm thinking about is Early Wynn. Early Wynn was a big, burly guy, and you stood up to him, and if he didn't like you, hey, he was going to put you on the seats. That's what he did, and so that's part of pitching. Today, they start getting brushbacks and all that kind of stuff, and arguments and fights. When my dad was playing, they didn't even have batting helmets. So they learned, if a pitcher was going to intimidate him, going to knock him down, they had to be ready for it. And the pitchers themselves, Early Wynn would say, hey, this is my office. You're trying to beat me. I'm trying to beat you, and that's what they did. So that's what I learned in baseball, and I was fortunate because I saw it from the inside.
George, you were very fortunate, George.
When you graduated high school, there was a decision to be made: go college or go into the pros.
Yeah, well, what happened is that my dad had a similar decision to make when he was in high school. He had to decide whether to accept a scholarship, baseball scholarship to Brown University or to turn professional, and he actually went to prep school for a year or two before he could make up his mind. For me, it was a little bit different. I knew I was going to go to Rutgers because my dad was a baseball coach, and my coaches, both basketball and baseball, told anybody who came around that was interested in me, and said, well, don't waste your time because he's going to go to Rutgers, period. And that was it. I mean, I told coaches and I told my dad from very early age that I wanted to go to Rutgers, and I was familiar with the school. I liked the school. And it was a place where I wanted to go, and I happened to be a pretty good student, so it wasn't that I was going to have any special consideration. But the fact is that I was able to play both basketball and baseball at Rutgers, so it was a good choice for me.
Good.
That's great.
Brown University, Ivy League. So your dad had some brains.
Yeah, he did. My dad was very bright. He just happened to be a natural athlete. I mean, from the time he was a youngster, he played baseball, basketball, tennis. He could play any sport. Tremendous hand-eye coordination. I was fortunate, I guess, because I developed some skills as well. But the fact is that my dad was extremely intelligent. And it was intelligent. It was not only baseball intelligent, it was just intelligent, period. So, if he went to Brown, he would have had a good education and would have done very well, I'm sure. But instead, his career path, he wanted to go was professional baseball, and that's what he did.
George, did the Depression have any bearing on his decision?
Alan, it might have. I mean, my dad was a child of the Depression, but it was a matter, that back then, I mean, everybody was, helping one another as best they could. My father happened to have, his parents were okay, and my mother's parents were okay. But the fact is, I have to think that the Depression had something to do with it. Baseball was a tremendous outlet. So my dad was playing ball, in the early 30s, and when the Depression, was really at its height. But his mother and father and my grandparents on both sides still had jobs, still had homes, so they weren't, adversely affected like so many millions of Americans were during the Depression.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. Ronnie, anything to add?
No, I think that's so fascinating with George and the experiences that he had. It was I'm envious of him. I'm happy that he had those experiences. I think it's terrific.
Well, I appreciate that, Ronnie.
I can imagine how your friends were very much admired you, and that you knew all these people so well. I'm sure it was very exciting for them.
Yeah. You also get to find out who your friends are and who just wants an autograph or get converted.
Right.
Well, you know what, hey, Ralph, it's funny, Roddy, it's funny you said that because, I've had many very, very good friends ever since junior high school. So, I mean, I learned, and some, would be people that you might not want to associate with. But on the other hand, if they were a good friend of mine, they were a good friend of mine. It wasn't just for baseball.
Sure. Yeah.
I
had the same thing,
George.
With this Jackie thing.
Mr. Integrity the Third. How about that?
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
David Hubler, anything you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
Well, you're talking about, it's funny when George was talking about pitchers who are not the big Bob Gibson size or Newcomb size. I immediately thought of Whitey Ford and of course Bobby Shantz as well. But George, when what you overlooked and didn't mention about pitching guile was that in 44 the Nats had four knuckleball pitchers.
Yes, they did. You're absolutely right, Dave. They did. Four knuckleball pitchers, right?
Right.
Starting. Starting rotation was four knuckleball pitchers. Three right-handed, one left-handed. And
no
again, and again, for me, I mean, because I knew Dutch Leonard, and Dutch was probably the premier knuckleball pitcher of his era. But, Dutch threw with his fingernails, and that's what they did. I mean, they called a knuckleball, but really a lot of knuckleball pitchers throw with their fingernails. And my dad used to laugh. He said, yeah, Dutch is always filing his nails down. It's got to be just the right, right length so he can, grip the ball for his knuckler. So.
Yeah, it was a finesse. Even today.
Did you anything about the knuckleball, George?
No, I never did. I saw guys try to hit him. I know that I saw guys try to catch him. And, if you'll recall that I think it was Paul Richards developed an oversized catcher's mitt for Gus Triandos to try to enable him to catch Hoyt Wilhelm's knuckleball, because I think it was Bob Uecker, and they asked Uecker one time, and I mean, he's great humorist, really funny guy. Say, hey, Bob, how do you catch a knuckleball? He said, well, I wait till it stops rolling, and then I pick it up.
Who were the catchers on Washington, and who was particularly good at catching a knuckleball?
Well, they had three. They had Rick Farrell, they had Al Evans, and they had Mike Guerra. And Farrell, I think, was probably the best. And Rick is in the Hall of Fame. Some say his brother Wes should have been, because Wes was a little bit better ball player. Wes was a pitcher, but had a terrible temper. Rick was very mild-mannered, but very accomplished. And I think Rick's daughter, I believe, had written a book about her father called Rick Farrell, Knuckleball Catcher. So his claim to fame was that he could really handle, a lot of the knuckleball pitchers, and obviously with the four of them on the Washington pitching staff, he had a lot of experience.
I have a story about Mike Guerra. I don't know if you've ever heard. A number of years ago, my book was premised on the novel that I was working on, and the fictional character was the third string catcher, because for various reasons he had to be a catcher. But anyway, I tried and I used the other catchers who were on the team in 1944. And I tried to get in touch with Mike Guerra, and I was able to get an address in Miami for him. And I sent. This was before you could just send an email to everybody in the world. And so I wrote him a letter. I got the address, I think, through Baseball Hall of Fame or SABR, I forget which. But anyway, I sent a letter, and I didn't hear anything. At least 3-4 months went by, and I figured, well, maybe he's passed or whatever. And so he wasn't a major character in the book, but I thought it would be nice to have some comments from him. Anyway, about 4, maybe even 5 months later, I got a note back in the mail from his wife, and she thanked me for the letter, and she said that Mike had died, but he had read your letter, and he was so happy to know that someone had remembered him as a major league catcher, and she thanked me for that. I still have the letter. It was just such a wonderful boost for me to receive that nice note from her.
Absolutely, you improved his life at the end.
Yeah.
Because so many of those. David, that is a great story, and I can understand that, because I remember my dad in his later years. He would be very, very pleased to receive fan mail, or have somebody call up and say, "Hey, I remembered you as a base stealer," or whatever. So I can understand how Mike Guerra would, his wife and himself before he passed, would obviously be very, very touched by the fact that you remembered him.
Right.
Because he was a third string catcher. I mean, A lot of guys would say, okay, Rick Farrell, Hall of Fame, or Al Evans, who played quite a bit as the backup, but Mike was a third string catcher. So for you to send a letter to him, and that was a big issue and a really nice gesture on your part.
Well, I was looking for it for some particular reason. For some reason I gravitate to second or third string catchers, because I had that story that I have told here about Charlie Silvera, who is still around, by the way.
Yeah, about the silverware, right?
The silverware, right? But it was sweet of her.
Charlie is still alive.
Yeah, I just said, he's still around. Mm-hmm.
And he's got on his mantle, in a jar, he's got Yogi Berra's jockstrap. And the reason he has it, and as he tells his friends...
Empty, I hope.
Pardon?
I said empty, I hope.
He tells his friends that anybody who thought I couldn't carry Yogi's jock, here it is. I thought that was a big one.
No, that's terrific, Ralph, because that is an old expression. You couldn't carry so and so's jockstrap. So that's a great story.
And who could? How many catchers? We'll ask Al Blumkin to name some of them. Came up while Yogi was a Yankee backstop. Let's name some of them.
We'll start with Sherman Waller.
Right.
We'll go Gus Triandos, Hal Smith, Hal Smith who hit the home run in the eighth inning of the Game 7 of the 1960 World Series, not the other Hal Smith who was played for the Cardinals. Lou Berberette, Clint Courtney. The list is too long to go, and Charlie Silvera only had 1 year in 1949 where he got even halfway decent playing time because Yogi had busted his thumb during the season and missed about a month. In fact, Silvera even caught one of the games in that World Series in 1949. It's the only World Series game that Yogi didn't play in.
World Series appearance. He's got 6 rings.
Yeah, and he would get up, play 10 games, and get up 30 times a year. Most of the time outside that season.
He would also joke that people thought that he was the illegitimate son of Casey. Now, if you look at their likenesses, it's almost uncanny. And there was something that kept him as backup catcher all those years. And I did an interview with him back in '95. And the one thing I remember from that interview, as I skip around in my head, go figure, is that he laughingly said that Rashi, Lopat, and
Reynolds
should go into the Hall of Fame as a trifecta. Anyway, that was memories of my interview. One other thing, I'm starting to write down the things I want to ask George. Who were some of the siblings of these players that came to your house that you might have kept in touch with over the years?
Well, yeah, one in particular, Ralph, and the fact is that she and I are very, very good friends, is Gay Vernon. And Gay was Mickey Vernon's daughter. Mickey did not have any sons. He had a daughter. Gay was was a broadcaster up in Boston, and she's retired now. She's living out in Arizona. She had me on her radio show many years ago up in Boston. So she's the one that I was very good friends with and talked with Gay quite a bit. And as a matter of fact, Gay asked me to speak on her dad's memorial service after Mickey had passed away, and I was very pleased to do that. So I would say that probably Gay Vernon was my closest friend. And as a matter of fact, then my sister, who's my sibling, Sid Hudson's 2 daughters, and Gay Vernon were very good friends with my sister. So, the next generation, does stay in touch. And I was fortunate to grow up with that and knowing some of those kids from the same age as I was. And I told some people, I haven't seen him in many years, would not even know him, or he would not know me. But when we were kids, we lived next door in College Park, Maryland, to Early Wynn. And Early Wynn's son, Joe Early, and I were kids together. We'd go to the ballparks together, and our fathers were, good friends. So, Joe Early was one that I knew at a very young age, and we can recall our past baseball experience.
George, I have to ask you, why was Early last name be Early Wynn's first name?
Well, you know what? It's funny you mention that because, David, I don't really know. I mean, his nickname was Gus. Now, Early Wynn, where the early part of it came from, I don't know. But his son's name was Joe Early Wynn. So Early must have been some kind of a family, name in his past where that name came from. But obviously Wynn was the last name. But the name Early is a very unusual name.
I'm going to cut out. I'm going to leave you guys here I see there's somebody at the door, and I've got door, and then I'll be back for 1:30.
All right. Good to talk to you as always, David.
Bye. The Hounds and Baskervilles. Bye-bye.
Yeah, that was Early Wynn's given name, and somebody asked me the other day on Facebook if I knew where he got the nickname Gus, and I said I didn't know. And then the guy, his name is Chip Lorch, found out that he got the nickname from Ellis Clary, who your father probably knew.
Oh, yeah. I did not know that at all, Alan. Yeah, Ellis Clary and my dad were very good friends. So, it could be that they just came up with the name Gus. I mean, I don't know. I always knew him as Early or Mr. Wynn, but Gus was what everybody who were ball players later on, that's what they called him. And he was a tough guy. I'm telling you one thing. Early often said, "Hey, if his grandmother got up there and dug in, he'd put her down." So, and as a matter of fact, he did his son Joe Early. Joe Early hit a couple shots off his dad during batting practice, and Early didn't want to hurt his own son, but he said, "I wanted to show him who was boss. I put him down."
Wow.
A different breed of cat. Remember, these guys, anybody who came out of the Depression has a different way of looking at things than we do. The privileged middle-class people from the 50s, big difference in mental makeup.
Ralph.
Well, that was true, Ralph. That was true, and I can only tell you for a fact. I mean, Alan asked earlier about the Depression, but these guys, I mean, many of them, were not. I mean, playing baseball was their way out. A lot of them, I think Bucky Harris was a coal miner and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it was a different world. A lot of them were not college educated the way they are today. So their minor league experiences, I mean, they could be 3, 4, 5 years in the minors working their ways up, but baseball was their way out, and that was their way of life. So I think the Depression certainly had an impact on many of the players.
Gentlemen, there was a story I read several places about Warren Spahn. He was once asked if he was ever afraid in the ball game. He said, "I grew up during the Depression. I fought some of the toughest battles in Europe in World War II. You think a game is going to scare me?"
Yeah, I'd heard that, Alan. I'd heard that, and Spahn was one of them. I mean, he won 350 games or whatever it was in his career, and did he did grow up and fought in World War II just like Cecil Travis. I mean, they faced combat. I mean, Warren Spahn, he was involved in, I think he was a decorated combat engineer in Germany.
He got a field promotion, which was very rare in those days.
Right, yep.
Well, he was a tremendous pitcher.
I think he was in the Battle of the
Bulge, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, they were. I mean, that was a lot of ball players. I said, the people would say, well, they played service ball, did all that, but some of them faced combat. I mean, Warren Spahn was one, Cecil Travis was one, Buddy Lewis flew the hump in Burma. I mean, Hank Greenberg was a forward spotter in the Army Air Force. I mean, Bob Feller was an anti-aircraft gunner on the USS Alabama. So, I mean, these guys, they served their country, and they served it well. They weren't just going around playing baseball. They were actually in a combat role many times.
There's a story I've heard several times about Hank Bauer. He fought in the Japanese theater. He was one of a handful of survivors of his unit. And years after, the Yankees went to Japan after the 1955 season. for a month, and the State Department put a meeting with some Japanese dignitary to meet the Yankees, and the Japanese dignitary asked, anybody been to the Far East before? And Bauer raised his hand and started reciting all the islands he had fought on. And the meeting ended very rapidly after that. He had 11 battle citations, Bronze Star and 2 Silver Stars.
Yeah, I think another one, Alan, was Gil Hodges. I mean, those guys, they did. And Bauer, he did. He fought in the Pacific Theater many, many times when they did all those island hopping campaigns. So, I mean, I think he was a Marine. Gil Hodges was a Marine. Ted Williams was a Marine. Marine. He was a Marine instructor in World War II, but he was a Marine aviator in Korea and almost lost his life. When he was shot down. So, I mean, those guys had some life experiences far beyond baseball, that's for sure.
And Yogi Berra was in one of the boats that escorted the troops to Omaha Beach on D-Day.
Yes, he was. He was.
Yeah.
I remember somebody asked him, he said, well, I thought it was really great. He said, I was on a rocket boat. And he said, I thought that really meant something. Well, what the rocket boat was they were shooting rockets into the shoreline during the World War II, during the Normandy D-Day invasion.
Wow. Also, I just wanted to mention about Hank Bauer lost an older brother in World War II who was reputed to be more talented than he was, for whatever that's worth. And hey, rest in peace to all these guys. I'll tell you, as I learn more and more about World War II history, that was not a given that we'd win that war.
No, it certainly wasn't.
There's a book that came out a couple of years ago, which I read a year ago, called The Victory Season by a man named Robert Weintraub. It's about 1946, and how all the players returned from the war, and he goes into quite a few of their war experiences. Yeah, there's a pitcher, Murray Dixon, who was in the National League with primarily the Cardinals and Pirates, who was one of the drivers for General Patton.
Right. Another one, while you're talking, was Bert Shepard. And Bert Shepard was shot down over Germany, had his leg partially amputated as a POW by German doctors, came back and actually pitched one game in the major leagues on his wooden leg. And Bert
Lou
and my
Brissy
dad
was another one like that.
Very good friends. Yep. And there were quite a few that had battle wounds and that kind of stuff. Lou Brissy, who went on to pitch for the A's, a book written about him. And Lou just passed away not too long ago, but I had a good opportunity to meet him a couple of years ago down at Veterans Day event at the ballpark in Washington. Lou Brissy, his daughter, wrote a book. The Corporal was a pitcher.
Yeah, I have that.
And that's what he was. Yep.
Yeah. And Bill Veeck was in the Marines, and he got his right leg shot off. He had to undergo tons of operations.
Yes, he did.
During that. And Ronnie, speaking of what you mentioned earlier about the sporting news, when Veeck goes into a lot of detail, and Veeck is in rec on this, when he signed Satchel Paige, the sporting news blasted him for taking advantage of old washed-up guys just because they were black. And when he was sensational in 1948, was 6-1 with an ERA of just over 2, and they actually put out a half-hearted apology.
Good.
And they said the reason he was so successful because baseball had deteriorated.
Yeah, the sporting news was not.
Each generation has an idealistic view that they're the only generation, and I remember when the Yankees of Jim Bouton, it was supposed to be a whole new era, the Bouton Phil Linz thing, and now they're looked at as they're old timers. So it's the passing of time, everybody, and no stopping it.
Sure is. Yep.
Guys, good show, Anything anybody wants to add before we close it out?
I just want to ask you, Ralph, one thing. Is there going to be a show Tuesday night?
Yes, there is.
Okay. That's all I wanted to know. Thank you.
Okay.
And we're off next week, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you guys are off next week because it's one-on-one with George.
Okay.
All right, gentlemen, thank you, and thank you for listening, everybody. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Ralph Tycho, the weak link of it all. In case you're wondering, with George Case. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Audii. Have a great
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.